Thank you for joining us today at this important dialogue on Reform Deadlock, the Way Forward. Your continued engagement with Bangladesh reflects a shared commitment to democratic governance, institutional accountability, and meaningful reform. Today's discussion is not merely about political disagreement. It is about the future character of Bangladesh state. It is about whether the sacrifices of the July Revolution will lead to democratic transformation, or whether those aspirations will once again be absorbed into the old cycle of authoritarian politics and institutional capture. Distinguished guests, the July Revolution of 2024 was not an ordinary protest movement. It was a historic national awakening. Students, workers, professionals, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens united against a deeply entrenched authoritarian order that had concentrated power, weakens our institution, manipulate elections, undermined judicial independence, and restricted freedom of expression. The people of Bangladesh demanded not cosmetic reform, but structural transformation. They demanded a republic where institutions would be stronger than individuals, where accountability would prevail over impunity, and where democracy would no longer depend on repeated sacrifice. Following the fall of authoritarian regime, an interim government was formed under the leadership of Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus with a clear national mandate, which was to reform state institutions, ensure justice for victims of repression, and oversee a democratic transition. On behalf of the National Citizen Party, we argued that meaningful reform required a new democratic constitution. We believed that Constitution of 1972 had evolved into a framework enabling excessive concentration of executive authority and one-party domination over the state. Without structural constitutional reform, democratic backsliding would inevitably return. However, due to resistance from powerful political actors, the proposal for a new constitution was abandoned. Instead, all parties agreed upon the July Charter as a framework for minimum but essential reforms. Despite our reservation, we accepted the Charter because it included critical safeguards like judicial independence, protection of constitutional bodies from executive interference, and the establishment of a proportional representation-based upper chamber to prevent unilateral constitutional manipulation. A national referendum was subsequently held on the July Charter and 48 reform proposals. The people overwhelmingly endorsed the reform agenda and approved the implementation mechanism. 8 core reform provisions concerning constitutional institution, the caretaker government framework, constitutional amendment procedures, and the upper house received direct democratic approval and therefore cannot be subject to partisan reinterpretation. The referendum further mandated the formation of a constitutional reform council composed of newly elected members of parliament tasked with completing the reform process within 180 working days. Before the election, BNP fully accepted this framework. Senior BNP leaders, including the current Prime Minister, publicly campaigned in favor of the referendum. Yet, immediately after assuming office, the government reversed its position. It refused to form the Constitutional Reform Council and rejected the implementation mechanism endorsed by the people. Essential reform ordinances introduced during the interim period were repealed one after another. Measures aimed at strengthening the Human Rights Commission, ensuring transparency in anti-corruption commission appointments, preventing enforced disappearance, reforming police oversight, protecting judicial independence, and establishing a Supreme Court Secretariat were all discarded. Despite several of these reforms previously aligning with BNP's own commitments. At the same time, the government retained and enacted laws expanding executive authority. Emergency provisions allowing removal of elected local representatives, politically motivated dismissal of public employees, and increased administrative control over institutions indicate a traveling return to centralized governance. This is the core of today's reform deadlock. The people voted for structural transformation, but the ruling establishment is attempting to preserve the old architecture of power through selective and superficial amendments. The government now seeks to amend the constitution through ordinary parliamentary procedures. Yet Bangladesh's constitutional history demonstrates the fragility of such an approach. Major amendments under successive governments, including 5th, 7th, 8th, 13th, and 16th amendments, were later struck down by the judiciary for violating the constitution's basic structure. Any attempt to impose fundamental structural change through ordinary amendments alone risks creating another cycle of constitutional instability and political confrontation. This is why we continue to demand the immediate formation of the Constitutional Reform Council in accordance with the referendum mandate. Genuine constitutional reform must be participatory, transparent, and rooted in popular sovereignty. Distinguished guests, the reform crisis is not limited to constitutional matters. Bangladesh is also witnessing the gradual return of economic mismanagement and institutional politicization. The interim government initiated reforms in banking and revenue administration to restore discipline and recover stolen assets. Many of those initiatives have now been abandoned. Recent amendments to the Bank Resolution Ordinance, returning financial institutions to politically connected business groups associated with past state capture. We are also witnessing increasing politicization of university, the civil administration, and major public institutions where partisan loyalty is increasingly prioritized over merit and professional competence. This undermines the neutrality of the state and weakens public confidence in national institutions. Equally concerning is the shrinking space for freedom of expression. Citizens have been arrested and prosecuted under the Cybersecurity Ordinance for social media activity, including content creator A.M. Hassan Nassim over allegation related to satirical political content. The July Revolution was fought to establish a democratic order where criticism and dissent would not be criminalized. Any return to intimidation, censorship, and fear directly contradicts the spirit of that uprising. Bangladesh also faces significant regional and humanitarian challenges. We are deeply concerned by recent developments in West Bengal, including reports of disenfranchisement, intimidation, and communal targeting of vulnerable communities. Any attempt to forcibly push marginalized population toward Bangladesh risks creating another humanitarian crisis in our region. We argue the international community to uphold the rights, dignity, and security of all minorities and vulnerable population in India and all other countries, especially in South Asia. At the same time, Bangladesh continues to host 1.2 million Rohingya refugees. The worsening conflict in Myanmar Rakhine State, particularly following the territorial advances by the Arakan Army, has intensified insecurity and displacement. Bangladesh cannot bear this burden indefinitely without meaningful international responsibility sharing and decisive diplomatic action. The international community must act collectively to ensure the safety of the Rohingya people and create conditions for their safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation. Excellencies, the crisis we face today is ultimately a crisis of political trust. The people of Bangladesh participated in a democratic uprising, endorsed reform through a referendum, and hoped for a transition toward a more accountable and inclusive republic. If those commitments are abandoned, public faith in democratic institutions may once again collapse. The National Citizen Party believes sustainable stability cannot be achieved through concentration of power, suppression of dissent, or symbolic reform. Stability can only emerge from democratic legitimacy, institutional independence, constitutional accountability, and respect for the sovereign will of the people. Despite the obstacle before us, we remain hopeful. Bangladesh has always moved forward through the courage and resilience of its citizens. We believe the democratic spirit awakened during the July Revolution cannot be permanently suppressed. The struggle for a democratic state based on justice, accountability, plurality, and human dignity continues. We remain committed to pursuing that struggle peacefully, democratically, and constitutionally, both inside Parliament and beyond it. Thank you once again for your presence, your attention, and your continued engagement with the people of Bangladesh. May peace, justice, and democracy prevail. Thank you very much.